Indigenous knowledge of the Great Lakes may be vast and long-standing, but so far it hasn't been at the forefront of policymaking. And for that matter, it may not be widely understood, both in approach and substance. With us to help explain why a new appreciation of that expertise is long overdue, we're joined from Treaty 6 Territories in Saskatchewan by Tasha Beeds, water walker and visiting professor at the Indigenous Legal Orders Institute at the University of Windsor's Faculty of Law. In Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, Dawn Martin Hill, professor in Indigenous Studies at Hamilton's McMaster University. And in Montreal, Quebec, George Kennedy, faculty lecturer at McGill's School of Continuing Studies. And we're delighted to have the three of you on our program tonight to shed some light on something that I think we all need a lot more knowledge about. So, Dawn, why don't we start with you? Let's start with this phrase, Indigenous ways of knowing. What is the sort of intent behind that phrase?
So Indigenous people have their own epistemologies and pedagogies, methodologies that have been accumulated for thousands of years based on their observations of the world around them, as well as keeping that information alive, stories through transmission, through ceremony. So it is a way of being. It's not a religion, nor is it just an education academic exercise. It's literally who they are as human beings, and the knowledge they possess is often been transmitted from a very long time. And we need access to that information because of the current situation we're in with climate change.
Well, Tasha, that was going to be my follow-up, which is to say, do you think it's adequately respected in non-Indigenous circles?
I do believe that there is a shift occurring in the broader consciousness of both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people within the context of Turtle Island or North America as you know it. But I do believe that there needs to be more education, more awareness, and more understanding of how we as Indigenous peoples conceptualize the water. Of course, for us, the water, like the earth, are living entities. And so when you begin to see the water as living, it creates a different frame of reference in your mind. And I think that the education and the activism of Indigenous people, particularly the grassroots people, has begun to create that shift in consciousness.
George, let me get you to follow up on that as well. Do you think the non-Indigenous world respects that information, those traditions, as much as they ought to?
Well, I believe there's a trend nowadays, like was mentioned earlier, with the social movements of Indigenous peoples across not only North and South America, but throughout the world as Indigenous peoples. They hold that knowledge, and I believe with the trend of academic institutions developing STEM programs. I think it is also reinforcing and creating a momentum with more grassroots people picking up that torch. But in my language, we call it Jeep Nyong Gwalihodo, which means our ways. And as Don had mentioned, that it's a way of life. It's not a religion, and that's how we move forward in our understanding in this lifetime.
What language was that you just spoke?
That was Oneida.
Gotcha. Okay.
Oneida Nation.
Understood. The momentum that you just referred to, Dawn, do you see that momentum in your daily activities?
There is a shift. I think the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change study of the world's ecosystem in 2018 and 2022 found, that Indigenous people hold 84% of the world's biodiversity in their hands. I think that was a shock to scientists. It was a shock to governments. And then in 2022, they found where Indigenous people receive no funds for conservation of their ecosystems, they're doing at par or better than well-funded organizations. So I think at COP26, they realized they needed to invest heavily in understanding what is Indigenous knowledge, how can it mitigate climate change and begin to conserve the biodiversity that we're currently losing at alarming rates. So I think the science spoke, and now people are listening, but we've been saying this all along. Elders have been going to the UN in the 90s, begging them to listen to what they had to say and to stop doing what they were doing, particularly to water. And it fell on deaf ears, unfortunately.
It fell on deaf ears in the past. Was there a specific thing that happened at a specific time that you think got people to sort of perk up and realize that they maybe ought to start paying a little more attention to this?
Well, I do think it's the trickle-down effect of that study of the Intergovernmental Panel. There was dozens and dozens of countries' data that was waded through by dozens of scientists globally. So this I think became aware to governments at the various sustainable development movement that they have at the UN, carbon footprint. So every time they have these events, this issue is brought up. Well, Indigenous people are the ones who are managing their environments, particularly their water, if they control and manage it. So that's the big difference. Six Nations does not control the Grand River. But if we did, it would be in a much better, healthier state than it currently is. So governance becomes critical to this discussion.
We'll come back to that in a bit. Tasha, maybe you could help us with a bit of a list here because, of course, across Turtle Island or North America, there are thousands of First Nations, but which are the ones that have been most significantly attached to the Great Lakes in your view?
In my view, it would be, of course, the Anishinaabe, but also the Haudenosaunee and historically the Wendat. And of course, now we've got many visiting Indigenous nations, but the knowledge that I've been kind of trained in is specifically that from the Anishinaabe worldview. And so the Great Lakes have been considered pivotal to Anishinaabe culture, history, and traditions. In fact, there's very much a relationship that was entered into in the Anishinaabeg stories. It goes back to the time of creation. And so, that's very, very old knowledge. And the relationship is still a living relationship. The Anishinaabeg of 2022 still carry those understandings and responsibilities on how to care for the water. And in fact have played significant roles in continuing to protect the water. And I think in this instance, of course, of the Saugeen First Nation, who created at one point they wanted to bury a nuclear waste along the shorelines of the Great Lakes, and it was the Saugeen First Nation who unanimously voted no. And so with that power that Professor Martin Hill was talking about, that power of agency and sovereignty, they were able to say no to that nuclear deposit. And so, I think that sense of care and sense of responsibility that Indigenous nations all along the Great Lakes have it's continued. Of course, that's a place of sustenance. Fishing was pivotal in the past and still very much is. It was a mode of transportation in terms of the canoes. Of course, all the Great Lakes are connected. People don't realize that, but whatever happens to one happens to all of the others too.
Oh, if they read Paddle to the Sea when they were kids, they know that they're all connected.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay. George, maybe I could get you to pick up the story. How would you say historical events or legislation that various Canadian governments have passed has affected the relationship that Indigenous communities have with the Great Lakes?
Well, I guess speaking to, one treaty that is known as the Nanfan Treaty, and this is going way back to pre-Confederation of 1701. Then with, there was two treaties, the 1701 Great Peace of Montreal, as well as the Nanfan Treaty of that same year, where the Haudenosaunee Lodianeso, or Confederacy, or Men with a Good Mind, they had diplomats go to negotiate a treaty respecting, I guess, the shared responsibility with the Western nations, going back to that far. So we all have that responsibility as the original peoples of the Great Lakes Basin, which covers all throughout that invisible border of that international border that actually does not. We are not. That's an invisible border that's over our heads. From other treaties. So our treaties are part of our legislation, which that is ingrained in our rights to the land. And most recently, the Attorney General of Ontario recognized that Nanfan Treaty when it came to hunting rates around the Hamilton area. Actually,
You found that to be a positive development, I guess.
yes.
Okay.
So these ancient treaties are, being honored, and they really need to be revisited in terms of our relationship with the Crown as allies.
Okay. Don, you mentioned Six Nations a few moments ago, so let me circle back to that. I take it you are Mohawk and live in Six Nations territory, is that right? Okay, which, for those who don't know, is near Brantford, Ontario. How would you describe, or how would you characterize your people's relationship to the Great Lakes?
Well, I just interviewed one of the traditional leaders, Jock, who's a knowledge holder, and asked him about different things. And he was explaining how the Great Lakes was made during the time of creation, which is our story of the twins, and how the Creator, in order to give humans drinking water, because there was ocean water here, according to our creation story, he dragged his fingers along the Great Lakes so that the water would be there, as well as put water underneath, which is really medicine. So our aquifers are precious and sacred to us. And in fact, the words in Mohawk for things like rain or water, it's about being precious. It's things that, like Oniganos, our research project, it's cherished. These are things you hold as the sustenance of life, and to take care of it with great care. So I think Six Nations has been really battling Nestle and now Blue Triton from draining our aquifer, while many of us go without access to clean drinking water because we don't get the funding that the federal government gave other communities to get access to clean water. We don't have the infrastructure. We don't have waste treatment plants. We don't have operating money. So our people pay for water to be trucked in. They pay for the septic to be removed. And, you can be upwards of $400 a month just to have access to things Canadians enjoy. So I think Six Nations is doing all that it can to try to provide services, but our source water, the Grand River, is, contaminated. We have 25 different waste treatment plants upstream from us. We have Uniroyal, who was dumping, PCBs and carcinogens. So there's a lot to clean up in that water. But we're in the same situation that many Canadians are going to find themselves in if they don't make different policies and water laws, which I hope Canada does, because their water laws are over almost 60 years old and don't even include Indigenous people. So I'm glad that they're recognizing treaties, because if we get our treaties recognized, we will start improving our ecosystems. That's a proven fact.
Well, that is certainly why we've invited the three of you to come on our airwaves tonight and share your wisdom on these issues. And Tasha, maybe you could help us with this. I introduced you at the beginning of our conversation as a water walker, and I'm not sure everybody knows what that means. So why don't you tell us what that means to be a water walker?
All right. Well, the Water Walk movement is actually, it began in 2003 with an Anishinaabe grandmother, a late Anishinaabe grandmother. She's since passed away, by the name of Josephine Bauman Dahlman. And we put the BA at the end of her name to recognize her as having passed on. But in 2003, she and a number of other grandmothers were following a call out by the Three Fires Medewin chief, Eddie Benton Benai, as well. He's passed on. And at that time, the elders were talking about a prophecy wherein water would eventually be worth more than her weight in gold. And at that time, they asked, what are you going to do about it? So Josephine Ba and a number of other grandmothers decided to take one of the Medewin water ceremonies out into the public eye, and they wanted to activate and move for the Great Lakes. And so she began walking. So essentially, the Water Walk is a ceremony where we take some of the source or the headwater in a copper vessel. You can see one behind me there. And we carry that, we kind of orphan the water from its original source. And then we walk along as close to the water's edge as possible. And so the Water Walk movement is about, first and foremost, it's a ceremony. It's to recognize that water is life. And while we're walking, we're praying and we're singing and we're speaking in the language, acknowledging the life that the water carries for us, but also looking ahead 7 generations. And while it's also more than a ceremony, because people, the way I conceptualize it, we become visual walking prayers. And so we're a physical representation of our inherent right to access to that water, and in our inherent right to have ceremony for that water. And so Josephine Ba, by the end of her, she walked for almost 20 years. And she accumulated almost 30,000 kilometers. I myself have walked for the water for 11 years. So I walked in 2015. We went from Matane, Quebec to Duluth. In 2017, we went back. And it's a very different, you see the world differently when you're walking alongside the water or on the earth herself versus, speeding in a train or a vehicle. And so you get to bear witness. And unfortunately, I've walked for, like I said, 11 years, almost 8,000 kilometers, a small amount compared to Josephine Ba. But in those 11 years, one of the most striking elements that I think we as water walkers have borne witness to is the amount of garbage, the amount of waste. I think of Junction Creek. I did a water walk for Junction Creek in 2021, and Junction Creek actually empties into Lake Huron. And so the amount of garbage, at one point I was at the shoreline in tears, because I don't think people realize that all of that garbage eventually finds its way into the Great Lakes. And as we've established, they're all connected. As of today, 22 million pounds of plastic enter the Great Lakes. And I mean, it sounds tremendous, but it's actually very frightening, because that plastic breaks down into something called microplastics. And microplastics are these teeny tiny minuscule amounts and they don't disappear. And so as a result, they enter into that life cycle. And in fact, one of the things that scientists have discovered is that as humans, we are now seeing children born with these microplastics in their bloodstream, and we as adults have them as well. So the Water Walk, as we move, we are gathering knowledge. We are gathering knowledge from those who live alongside the shore. We're gathering knowledge from the water herself. And we interact. Many non-Indigenous people, we carry a Eagle water staff and this copper pail. And so when you're walking, people come up and, what are you doing? And so it becomes a method of education too. And so, we can engage the farmers or people just wondering, exactly are you doing? So it becomes a platform for education too. Yeah, it's all about activating for different bodies of water. And so it is a ceremony, and anyone can join us. So that's another element that's educational for particularly for non-Indigenous people, but also for those who may have been divorced from their Indigenous knowledges through colonial practices. Anyone can walk for the water. And so we often have people come out. I think about the Kawartha Lakes. My teachers, Liz Oswamick and Shirley Williams, they have done walks there for 7 years. And when we first started, there was maybe, they had maybe 10 women. By the end of those 7 years, we had 300 people walking with us. And so it really is a movement that everyone can take part of.
If they want to take part in it, if they want to find out when the next walk is happening, how do they do that?
We do have a social media site that I'm going to be rolling out really shortly. It's called, you can find it under www.waterwalkers.ca. It's a website that I've created to help promote the water and promote my work with the water. And so there is a list of upcoming water walks on that website.
Great. We'll have a look at that. Thank you for that. George, your teachings have been passed down over the years. Generation to generation to generation to generation, and on and on. For those who don't know, how far back do you think these oral histories go?
Well, since creation, as was mentioned before, I think that the word, at the time of creation is when kind of the natural law was outlined, and our responsibilities were outlined to us, initially with our 4 basic ceremonies. Well, they're not really basic, but fundamental. So that's how we carry ourselves as Ongwehonwe or Anishinaabe, is through those original teachings, and they go back, at least a couple thousand, maybe even like 3,000 years ago, like in terms of the northeastern, when it goes back, some say since time immemorial. So
Okay. Don, maybe I could follow up with you on that. What do you think Indigenous knowledge and history bring to our understanding of water and nature?
I think that Canadians, North Americans, the settler society, who've been here, maybe 400 years, need to listen to the people that have been here since millennia. And, it's about the teachings of this land and what our people have accumulated. It's the domain of women. Women have carry water with children. We understand in our teachings, when Sky Woman came here, she was carrying children. So water is a being. It has a spirit. You have a relationship with it. And these teachings go back time immemorial. We to date, one of the newer Great Law of Peace, we're looking at 1198. To date, our knowledge of water, we're looking at our Ganyo Hanyo, which our children say every single day in school. We say it in meetings and ceremony. It's something we say. We give thanks to water. I think if Canadians practiced that mindfulness and thankfulness and understanding that we need laws to protect our water. We need to not export our water to multinational companies, that this is the sustenance of life. I think the values is what we offer, not only Canadians or Americans, but the world needs to begin understanding Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and then apply laws to steward those resources that are really gifts, according to our teachings, for humans. Animals will survive without us. Everything will survive without humans. We need everything to survive. So we're kind of the opposite of the man on top of the human chain. We look at it as we're children, and we are dependent on everything our mother, the earth, gives us. And I think that's what we hope Canadians will begin to appreciate, and I really do think young people are, because they've been exposed to Indigenous ways of knowing a little bit more. I'm hoping that there's a shift in values and that money isn't always the answer to happiness, because if you don't have water, it doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't drink or eat money. You can't drink or eat oil.
Let me ask you a quick
getting our
follow-up on that. On the
values
issue,
would be.
yeah, let me ask you
Yeah.
a quick follow-up on this, that issue of values. If you've been here for 400 years and you don't listen to people who've been here for 3,000 years, what value do you think that demonstrates?
Well, I think that they brought values from their home countries, which were very oppressive, and I think that children change, generations change, and I think that my hope is in the young people, that I see a very major shift in young scientists. The team that I work with, they're really beginning to understand they got things wrong, and now they're looking at the disasters happening, whether it's in out east, or it's happening to people in the north. You're having major human consequences for not taking care of this environment, as our people pleaded for generations to please consider the future of children, and that's what we hope. The Great Lakes is there for all of us to enjoy, for the future. And I think it's a good story in a sense that the Great Lakes exist, and we're at least trying to clean it up. We just need more people to care deeply about our water.
Well, let me
And
get
I think
George to
young
follow up
people
on
do.
that, because we've got just a couple of minutes left here. And Tasha gave us an example a few minutes ago about waterwalker.ca, how people can participate in that. George, maybe you can give us some other ideas about how people in their daily lives could demonstrate an added awareness, understanding, respect for, care for the Great Lakes that we all so depend on. How could they do it?
Well, I find that I'm originally resided in southwestern Ontario, just outside of London, and there's even our community faces contaminants coming down the Thames River, and we also have the challenge of the Toronto garbage coming just on our doorstep, basically. But we do have our water checked all the time, and it seems like when there are things that are not wanted, they're like this whole thing. I know I'm kind of going a little bit north from the Great Lakes, but Kirkland Lake was battling the nuclear waste. So all of the contaminants, that they're being sought next to First Nations that may not have, the power to stop the movement. So I think allyship is something that we really need to encourage, because of colonization. Some communities may not value that allyship that can be created. But I really think that what really can happen, not only just one of the things I've heard scientists be mentioned quite a bit, and when I was out west I visited the Squamish territory, and Reuben George got allies with, I can't remember which institution, but they provided the science, which stated that there is going to be an oil spill. It's just a matter of when. So there are a number of ways. Local MP is the way citizens can preserve, because we're all in this together. It's not just First Nations that are going to be affected, as Dr. Don Hill had mentioned as well. This is a human fight, for our existence. And if we don't adhere to helping each other out, we're all in the same boat. It's just a matter of time.
Tasha, let me give you the last word. We've got a minute left to go. How about all of us pitching in? What can we do?
Well, I think on the basic level, again, educate yourself, educate your children, think about the water as a precious commodity, get rid of your lawns, think about how you're using water, have shorter showers, take care of the water that exists now, cut back on your use of plastics. That's probably something everybody can do. And as consumers, we also have power, right? I mean, if we stop purchasing plastic, all of us, then the demand is going to lessen. And so we can have that individual autonomy within our households that can trickle out into the broader political realm and the national realm. But I think for me, one of the most pressing ones is to teach your children to enter into a relationship with the water. If you conceptualize the water as a living entity, you're going to look at the water very, very differently. Again, in Anishinaabeg and other Indigenous traditions, we conceptualize the water as feminine. So what I challenge students and other people to do is, think about that water as your aunt or your sister, your grandmother. Would you go and dump a bunch of garbage in your grandmother's lap, or would you spill oil all over her? Would you throw out your waste on top of your grandmother, your auntie? But we see that along the shoreline of the Great Lakes. Take a bag, get your school involved, get your children involved, go for a walk, take a garbage bag with you, pick up the garbage safely, of course. And then again, educate. Just Google, how can I reduce my use of plastic, right? How can I contribute to keeping the water safe? How can I reduce my water consumption? One of the largest things that we saw, particularly on the Saskatchewan River Water Walk, was the drought. There was so little water available, and most people don't respond until it impacts them directly. And one of the messages is from the water is that you need to respond now, because it will impact each and every one of us. The word for climate change from an Indigenous perspective, for me, when I think of climate change, I think of the Earth's response to the neglect that we as humans have participated in. And so I think we can perhaps, one of the things Josephine Bauman-Dahlman always used to say is that we can discontinue our negligence. We can turn things around. I'm not sure if we're still at that point, but as a grandmother, I have to have hope. I have to have hope that people will listen to the messages being carried by Indigenous elders and knowledge holders. Because as a grandmother, what are my grandchildren going to have to face? What are your children and grandchildren? The question is, what kind of ancestor are you going to be? What kind of stories will your grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren tell about you? For me, I can say my grandchildren will know that I used my body to activate for the water, to try to raise consciousness about the need to protect what little water we have left.
Some great advice there. Thank you so much to Tasha Beeds, Dawn Martin-Hill, George Kennedy for joining us on TVO tonight. We're truly grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.